Florida Highway Patrol officers file thousands of incident reports every year. Most document what you'd expect: traffic violations, crashes, disabled vehicles, routine enforcement actions. But some reports contain observations that were logged, reviewed, and then filed away without follow-up. Not because they were unimportant, because they didn't fit into any investigative category that had a procedure attached to it. These aren't ghost stories. They're administrative records. They exist in filing systems, cold case databases, and FOIA accessible archives. They were written by trained observers who documented what they saw, what they were told, and what they couldn't explain. And in many cases, the reports were never challenged, never investigated further, and never resolved. They were simply classified as informational, closed administratively, or allowed to go cold. This video examines 10 cases where Florida Highway Patrol officers, county investigators, or federal agencies documented something that was never fully explained. Not folklore, not urban legend. Documented incidents with case numbers, filing dates, and named agencies. What was recorded, what was investigated, and what was left unanswered. On December 29, 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 crashed into the Everglades, approximately 18 miles northwest of Miami International Airport. The Lockheed L-1011 descended into the swamp at over 200 miles per hour in controlled flight, meaning the aircraft was intact and flyable, but the crew had become fixated on a malfunctioning landing gear indicator light and failed to notice the autopilot had disengaged. 101 people died. 75 survived, many severely injured. The National Transportation Safety Board's final report attributed the crash to crew distraction and inadequate altitude monitoring. The wreckage came to rest in one of the most inaccessible environments in the continental United States. The Everglades at night, in winter, in waist-deep water, thick with sawgrass and mud. Florida Highway Patrol officers were among the first responders, coordinating with the Coast Guard, local fire rescue, and National Guard units. Recovery operations took weeks. Bodies were retrieved slowly. Some remains were not located for months. The crash site, even today, is difficult to reach without airboats or helicopters. Eastern Airlines, following standard industry practice, salvaged undamaged components from the wreckage. Avionics, galley equipment, seats, and other functional parts were inspected, refurbished, and reinstalled on other L-1011 aircraft in the fleet. This was not unusual. It was economically rational and approved by the FAA. What happened afterward, however, was unusual enough that it prompted internal company memos, component removals, and eventually, public documentation. Flight crews and passengers on Eastern Airlines flights, specifically those using aircraft fitted with salvaged parts from Flight 401, began reporting apparitions, not vague sightings, specific, detailed encounters. Captain Bob Loft, who died in the crash, was reportedly seen in the cockpit and passenger cabin of multiple aircraft. Flight engineer Don Repo, also killed in the crash, was seen in galleys and near avionics base. The reports came from flight attendants, pilots, and passengers who had no knowledge of which planes contained salvaged components. In several cases, witnesses identified the men from photographs after the fact. John G. Fuller's 1976 book, The Ghost of Flight 401, compiled dozens of these accounts. Fuller interviewed witnesses directly, including Eastern Airlines employees who were still active crew members at the time of publication. Some refused to go on record publicly, but provided detailed statements. Others, including senior crew, confirmed that they had filed internal incident reports describing encounters that could not be explained by fatigue, misidentification, or psychological stress. At least one flight engineer reported that Don Repo appeared to him in a lower equipment bay and warned him of an impending mechanical issue, which was later found and corrected during inspection. Eastern Airlines never issued a public statement confirming or denying the reports, but internal documentation shows the airline took action. Salvaged components were quietly removed from certain aircraft. Crew members were reassigned or debriefed privately. The airline did not dispute Fuller's research publicly, but it also did not cooperate with further inquiries. When asked directly, company representatives declined to comment on personnel matters or internal safety reviews. What makes this case relevant to Florida Highway Patrol documentation is the role FHP officers played in the immediate aftermath. Their incident reports describe a crash site that defied conventional recovery protocols. Officers noted the extreme difficulty of accessing wreckage, the time lag between impact and full victim recovery, and coordination failures among responding agencies. Some reports reference incomplete inventories of human remains and components. Others note the psychological toll on recovery personnel, several of whom requested reassignment after extended time at the scene. The NTSB's official findings are clear. Mechanical failure and crew error caused the crash. But the NTSB does not investigate what happens to salvaged parts after they leave a crash site. That falls to the airline, the FAA, and in some cases, to no one. The reports from crew members were not filed with federal investigators. They were handled internally, and then those internal records were sealed or destroyed per company retention policies. The question is not whether apparitions are real. The question is why a major airline would quietly remove functional, FAA-approved components from active service aircraft if the only issue was superstition. Eastern Airlines operated under strict cost controls. Equipment was expensive. Removing parts that passed inspection cost money and required justification. Something in those internal reports was serious enough to warrant that cost. Flight 401's wreckage still lies in the Everglades. Some of it was removed. Much of it remains, slowly sinking into the muck. The crash is part of FHP's historical record, one of the largest recovery operations the agency has ever coordinated. The reports filed by officers that night describe chaos, confusion, and an environment that made documentation difficult. Whether that environment also made other things possible is not something the reports attempted to answer. Between January and August of 1975, 5 young women were found dead along a 20-mile stretch of US 27 running through Broward and Palm Beach counties. Each victim's car was found abandoned on the highway shoulder or on a nearby service road, and each vehicle had a flat tire or other disabling damage. The bodies were discovered in canals, drainage ditches, or dense brush within a few hundred feet of the roadway. None of the cases were solved. All remain open with county sheriff's offices and are listed in state and federal cold case databases. The victims were Cynthia Polson, found in February; Deborah K. Smith, found in March; Sherry Harlan, found in April; Susan Ward, found in June; Linda Hahn, found in August. Their ages ranged from 16 to 22. Each was alone in her vehicle. Each was traveling during daylight or early evening. Each was found within days of being reported missing. None had been sexually assaulted, though all showed signs of violence. The precise cause of death varied. Some were strangled, others drowned. One died from blunt force trauma. But the circumstances preceding death followed an identical pattern. US 27 in 1975 was a 2-lane rural highway cutting through sugarcane fields, cattle ranches, and undeveloped wetland. It connected the western edges of suburban sprawl to farming communities further inland. The road had no streetlights for miles at a stretch, no emergency call boxes, no consistent cellular coverage because cellular networks did not yet exist. Gas stations and services were sparse. Florida highway patrol coverage was thin. Officers patrolling the route might pass the same mile marker once or twice per shift, if at all. The roadway's design made it isolating by default. A vehicle stopped on the shoulder was visible to passing traffic, but there was little passing traffic. Sight lines were blocked by tall crops or vegetation. Side roads led into private agricultural property or dead-ended at canals. A person standing beside a disabled car could be seen from the road, but would be difficult to reach without stopping and walking back. That gap between visibility and accessibility created a corridor of vulnerability. FHP officers responded to each of the abandoned vehicles, usually after a passing motorist reported seeing a car on the shoulder for an extended period. In some cases, the vehicle had been there for hours before anyone called it in. Officers documented flat tires, empty interiors, keys left in the ignition or on the seat, and no sign of struggle inside the car. The women had exited their vehicles and then vanished. Their bodies were located later, sometimes during organized searches, sometimes by farm workers or utility crews. Investigators from Palm Beach and Broward Sheriff's offices worked the cases separately at first. The jurisdictional line ran through the middle of the corridor, splitting responsibility. It took months before a formal task force was convened to examine the possibility of a linked suspect. By that time, the pattern had continued long enough that a suspect profile should have been clear. But it wasn't. No witnesses reported seeing anyone else on the road. No forensic evidence connected the scenes. No similar cases were documented in surrounding counties that could expand the suspect's operating area. What made these deaths particularly difficult to explain was the flat tire constant. 5 vehicles, 5 disabled tires. Flat tires are common, but 5 in a row on the same stretch of road, each belonging to a young woman traveling alone, and each followed by a homicide. That is not random. It suggests either deliberate disablement or a predator who identified and targeted vehicles already disabled. Either scenario requires the suspect to have been present on the road repeatedly without being noticed. The FHP incident reports from 1975 describe a highway that had been flagged by officers for safety concerns unrelated to these cases. Long sight distances with no breakdown lanes, limited turnaround points, inadequate lighting at intersections. The road was not designed for the volume of traffic it had begun to carry as suburban development pushed westward. But those concerns were not addressed with infrastructure improvements. No additional lighting was installed. No emergency call boxes were added. The road remained as it was. One investigator interviewed in a later retrospective noted that the suspect likely knew the area intimately. The side roads, the canal access points, the gaps in patrol coverage. That suggests either a local resident or someone who worked in the area regularly. But no suspect matching that profile was ever publicly identified. No arrests were made. No charges were filed. The investigation went cold, not because it was closed, but because it stopped producing leads. In the decades since, US 27 has been widened, lit, and developed. The sugarcane fields have largely been replaced by housing developments and commercial corridors. The road is no longer isolated, but the cases remain open. The vehicles, the flat tires, the bodies found in canals, all documented, all unresolved. FHP's role was limited to initial response and scene documentation. The investigation belonged to county agencies. But FHP officers were the ones who kept finding the cars, kept filing the reports, and kept noting that the pattern was repeating itself on a road they had already marked as dangerous. The question that was never answered is not who killed these women. It is how someone managed to do it 5 times in 8 months on a highway that, despite its isolation, was still a public road with daytime traffic and regular patrol. How does a predator operate in plain sight, without leaving evidence, without being seen, and without making a mistake that produces a suspect? The case files do not provide an answer. They document what was found and what was not. What remains is the gap between the two. Between 1985 and 2018, Florida Highway Patrol officers assigned to Alligator Alley and the Tamiami Trail filed at least 7 separate reports describing unidentified light sources visible from the highway, located deep in the Everglades interior. The reports share consistent details: stationary or slowly moving lights, elevated above ground level, appearing in areas with no road access, no structures, and no documented human activity. Each report was marked informational only and forwarded to district supervisors. None were investigated as primary incidents. The standard explanation offered for lights in the Everglades is swamp gas, methane released from decaying vegetation that can spontaneously ignite when it reaches the surface. It's a real phenomenon, documented in wetland environments worldwide. But methane fires are brief, ground level, and occur in saturated marsh environments where organic matter is actively decomposing. The lights described in FHP reports were sustained, elevated, and in several cases observed over hardwood hammock terrain, areas that are dry, elevated islands within the wetland matrix where methane accumulation is unlikely. One report from 1996 describes a light visible for over 40 minutes, stationary at an estimated height of 15 to 20 feet above the tree line, in an area that satellite imaging later confirmed had no wetland characteristics. The officer's notation includes compass bearing, estimated distance, and the fact that the light extinguished suddenly rather than flickering out, which methane ignition does not typically do. What makes these reports notable is not that officers saw lights, it's that they filed formal documentation about them. FHP officers are trained observers who write reports under the expectation of legal and procedural scrutiny. A filed report is not casual commentary. It's a permanent record tied to the officer's name, badge number, and shift log. Filing a report about something easily dismissed or explainable carries professional risk, particularly if it invites ridicule or questions about judgment. The fact that multiple officers in separate years, with no indication they were aware of each other's reports, used nearly identical language to describe similar phenomena, suggests they observed something that resisted immediate classification. The Everglades interior is not a place you casually investigate. The areas described in these reports have no roads, no trails, no dry ground access. Reaching them would require airboat, specialized navigation equipment, and knowledge of tidal water flow patterns that shift accessibility every 6 hours. The Everglades is not a static landscape. It's a river, 50 miles wide and moving slowly south, covered in sawgrass and punctuated by tree islands that look identical from a distance. Without GPS and environmental familiarity, it is one of the easiest places in the United States to become disoriented and lost. This is not an environment where you send a patrol unit to check something out. The logistical cost of mounting an investigation into a non-threatening light source, visible only at night, in terrain that requires multi-agency coordination and specialized equipment, is prohibitive. And so, the reports were filed, forwarded, and nothing further was done. In November 2020, the body of Brianne Slabaugh was recovered from a remote section of Everglades National Park, several miles from the nearest trail or waterway access point. Collier County Sheriff's Office and the FBI determined that her death was the result of a murder-for-hire plot involving her estranged husband and his girlfriend. Both were arrested and charged. The investigation confirmed motive, confirmed conspiracy, confirmed the involvement of the two suspects. What was not explained in the public record is how Slaubaugh's body reached the location where it was found. The recovery site required an airboat, a National Park Service ranger with specialized Everglades navigation experience, and daylight conditions to safely access. It was not near a canal, not near a hiking trail, not near any of the limited public access points within the park. The terrain surrounding the site is sawgrass marsh, interspersed with deep water channels that are invisible from the surface and shift location depending on recent rainfall. Navigation requires knowledge of ground elevation, water depth, and the location of hardwood hammocks that provide the only stable ground for miles. The two suspects had no documented experience with Everglades navigation, no known familiarity with the park's interior, and no indication in the case file that they possessed the tools or expertise necessary to reach that location in the dark, which, given the timeline of events, would have been required. The FBI case file and the Collier County Sheriff's incident reports confirm the convictions, but do not address the logistics of body placement. There is no testimony describing how the suspects transported the victim, no evidence logs showing recovery of an airboat or specialized equipment, no witness accounts of the suspects acquiring navigational assistance. The location was treated as fact in the legal proceedings. The body was there. Recovery confirmed its identity. Charges followed. But the mechanism by which two individuals, unfamiliar with one of the most disorienting environments in the country, successfully navigated to a site that trained park rangers describe as difficult to reach, even in daylight, was never detailed in accessible public documents. The Everglades functions as an evidence destruction system. Water degrades forensic material. Heat accelerates decomposition. Wildlife scatters remains, and vegetation grows rapidly enough to obscure ground-level disturbances within weeks. The environment does not preserve crime scenes. It erases them. This makes it attractive for body disposal, but also extraordinarily difficult to navigate with intent. You cannot simply drive into the Everglades, walk 100 yards, and assume you'll find your way back. The landscape provides no reference points, no linear paths, no stable ground. Experienced outdoorsmen have died from disorientation in the Everglades after becoming separated from their airboats by less than 50 yards. The idea that two individuals with no documented wilderness experience entered this environment, at night, transported a body to a location that required specialized knowledge to access, and exited successfully raises a question that the investigation did not answer. How? FHP officers participated in the search operation. Their role in Everglades recoveries is coordination rather than direct search. They secure highway access points, manage jurisdictional communication, and provide logistical support for agencies that operate within the park. But the patrol logs from the nights surrounding the estimated disposal timeline contain no reports of unusual vehicle activity near Everglades access points. No citations issued to vehicles parked in restricted areas. No stops involving individuals matching the suspect's descriptions. The disposal occurred within a corridor that FHP patrols regularly, along a highway where any vehicle parked on the shoulder or exiting onto an unpaved access road would be noted and investigated. And yet, there is no corresponding report. Jurisdictional complexity makes investigations in the Everglades procedurally difficult. The area falls under National Park Service authority, but access points are monitored by FHP. Surrounding counties provide sheriff's deputies. The Miccosukee tribe operates its own police force within reservation boundaries. and U.S. Fish and Wildlife enforces federal environmental law. When a crime scene spans these boundaries, documentation fragments across agencies, each with different reporting standards and record retention policies. What one agency considers a critical detail, another may log as supplementary information, and there is no centralized system that cross-references these records automatically. This means patterns can exist across agency filings without any single agency recognizing them. The lights remain unexplained. The body placement remains unexplained. Both are part of the official record, documented, verified, investigated to the extent that convictions were secured in one case and procedural reports were filed in the other. But the gap between what was recorded and what was resolved is wide enough that questions remain embedded in the case files, unanswered not because they were asked and dismissed, but because they were never formally posed. Interstate 4 between Sanford and Orlando contains a half-mile stretch near mile markers 10 through 15 that has a statistically higher accident rate than the sections immediately before and after it. Florida Department of Transportation crash data, compiled over multiple decades, consistently shows this concentration. The accidents are not uniform in type. They include rear-end collisions, single-vehicle rollovers, sideswipes, and head-on impacts in both directions. What unifies them is frequency and witness descriptions of driver behavior immediately before impact, often characterized as sudden, inexplicable, and inconsistent with road conditions at the time. FDOT has studied this section repeatedly. Engineering assessments have examined lane width, shoulder design, curve radius, sightline distance, pavement texture, and traffic volume patterns. The road design in this stretch is not meaningfully different from surrounding miles. There are no sharp curves, no obstructed sightlines, no merge points that would explain the clustering. Lighting is consistent with state highway standards. Signage is regulation compliant. Surface conditions are monitored and maintained on the same schedule as adjacent sections. The traffic volume is high, but not significantly higher than other urban interstate corridors in Florida that do not exhibit the same accident concentration. Every standard variable that transportation engineers use to assess roadway safety has been measured, and none of them accounts for the pattern. FHP officers assigned to this corridor are aware of the statistical anomaly. It appears in district briefings, in shift handover notes, and in the informal knowledge that gets passed between officers who work the same area over time. Some officers describe a heightened state of alertness when patrolling this stretch, a reflexive scanning for brake lights or erratic lane drift that precedes an accident. Whether this awareness is a function of the data or something observed through cumulative experience is unclear. But the result is that officers working this section expect accidents and position themselves accordingly. Witness statements from accidents in this area frequently include descriptions of driver behavior that began suddenly. A vehicle traveling at consistent highway speed abruptly decelerates, swerves without apparent cause, or stops in an active lane. In several cases, surviving drivers reported no memory of the moments immediately before impact, describing a gap in recall between normal driving and the collision itself. Other drivers involved in multi-vehicle accidents reported that the initiating vehicle's behavior appeared reactive, as though the driver was responding to something in the roadway that was not visible to other motorists. One witness statement from a 2003 accident described the car ahead as swerving like it was avoiding something, but there was nothing there. The stretch of I-4 in question was constructed in the early 1960s. The route was surveyed and graded over land that had been largely undeveloped for decades. Agricultural, scrub, and wetland terrain south of Sanford. During construction, workers encountered a burial site. The graves were not marked with headstones, and were not part of any mapped cemetery. Local history research, conducted later by regional historians and journalists, identified the site as the remnants of a settlement that had been abandoned in the 1880s following a yellow fever outbreak. Families affected by the epidemic had buried victims quickly in unmarked graves, and the settlement was depopulated within months. No formal cemetery was established, no records were transferred to county administration, and by the time highway construction began 70 years later, there were no surviving family members and no documentation that would have flagged the site during environmental surveys. The graves were not relocated. Highway construction proceeded over them. This was not unusual for the era. Mid-20th century infrastructure projects frequently prioritized speed and cost over archaeological or historical preservation, particularly in areas with no active land use conflicts. The bodies remain beneath the roadbed. Florida Department of Transportation has no official comment linking the burial site to the accident rate. The two facts exist in separate records, one in highway construction archives, the other in traffic safety databases. And FDOT has not issued any analysis suggesting a connection. From an engineering perspective, there is no mechanism by which the presence of human remains beneath a roadbed would influence vehicle operation or driver behavior. The road surface is stable, the subsurface is compacted and monitored, and there is no structural defect. But the accident data remains. The clustering persists across decades, across changes in vehicle technology, across shifts in traffic volume and demographics. It is not worsening, but it is not resolving. Officers continue to respond to collisions in this area at a rate that exceeds projections based on traffic models. The statistical concentration is narrow enough that it cannot be dismissed as generalized urban interstate risk, but wide enough that it spans multiple lanes, both directions, and occurs at different times of day and under varying weather conditions. When a pattern is geographically specific, temporally persistent, and resists explanation through standard variables, investigative protocols typically expand the scope of inquiry. You examine secondary factors, environmental conditions, driver demographics, vehicle types, time of day correlations, seasonal variation. FDOT has done this. The analysis has been thorough, and yet the rate remains elevated. What happens when all standard explanations are insufficient? In engineering and safety analysis, the assumption is that more data will eventually resolve the anomaly. You collect more crash reports, refine your models, introduce new variables. But if the data accumulates and the pattern persists unchanged, the question shifts. Not from what causes the accidents, but what variable is absent from the analysis. There is no scientific basis for the idea that knowledge of a burial ground affects driver behavior. Human remains beneath a roadway do not emit signals, do not alter vehicle mechanics, do not create environmental conditions that would distract or impair a driver. But the information exists now in public record and local knowledge, and it's unclear whether that awareness influences driver psychology. Does knowing you are driving over graves create subconscious distraction? Does the expectation of danger produce hypervigilance that paradoxically increases accident risk? These are questions that sit outside the scope of traffic engineering, but inside the scope of human behavior. FHP officers do not file reports that speculate on causes. They document what happened: vehicle positions, skid marks, witness statements, injuries, fatalities. The reports from this section of Volume 4 are procedurally identical to reports from any other interstate corridor. There is no notation that says driver behavior was inexplicable. There is no checkbox for accident occurred in statistically anomalous zone. The officers write what they see, and what they see is vehicles colliding at a higher frequency than surrounding areas, often initiated by driver actions that do not match the conditions at the time. The I-4 dead zone is not an official designation. It is a name that emerged from local usage, from journalists, from drivers who are aware of the history and the statistics. FDOT does not use the term. FHP does not use the term. But the stretch is known, and the knowledge affects how people interact with it. Indeed, whether that manifests as heightened caution, avoidance of certain lanes, or simply an awareness that this half-mile is different. The accident rate is not extreme. It is elevated. It is persistent, and it has no complete explanation. FDOT will continue to monitor it. FHP will continue to respond. Drivers will continue to pass through, and the graves will remain where they have been for more than a century, beneath the roadbed, unmarked and unacknowledged in any formal capacity. A historical fact that exists in parallel with a statistical anomaly that no analysis has fully resolved. When a Florida Highway Patrol officer files a formal report about something they observed on duty, that report becomes part of the official record. It's not a casual mention. It's documentation that the officer determined met the threshold for entry into the system. So when multiple officers, across multiple years, file reports describing the same phenomenon in the same location, and those reports are marked informational with no follow-up investigation, the question isn't whether the officers saw something. The question is what they saw and why no one tried to find out. 4 separate FHP officers, working different shifts in different years, filed reports describing an amber light visible from US 319 south of Sopchoppy in Wakulla County. Each report documented the same characteristics: stationary, amber or orange in color, appearing at night in a heavily forested area with no road access. The light was described as not matching the appearance of vehicle headlights, structure lighting, or aircraft. No source was identified by FHP or the Wakulla County Sheriff's Office. Each report was classified as informational. None triggered an investigation. US 319 runs through the Apalachicola National Forest. Rural, sparsely populated, minimal commercial development. There are almost no artificial light sources in the area where the reports were filed. A stationary amber glow in the environment should be easy to trace. Either it's a fixed structure with electrical service, a vehicle that remained in place long enough to be observed multiple times, or something else. The reports don't suggest the light moved or behaved erratically. It was simply there, visible from the highway, unexplained. What makes this pattern notable is not the reports themselves, but their consistency. Different officers, different nights, same location, same description. That suggests the phenomenon is repeatable. It appeared more than once under conditions that allowed observation. If it were a vehicle, why would it return to the same position repeatedly? If it were a structure, why does no property record, utility connection, or survey map account for it? If it were a natural phenomenon, bioluminescence, methane ignition, atmospheric reflection, why didn't anyone document that conclusion? The classification matters. Informational means the report was entered for record purposes, but did not generate investigative action. That's typically reserved for observations that don't meet the threshold for criminal, traffic, or safety concerns. Something seen, noted, and filed. But 4 reports over multiple years describing the same unexplained phenomenon in the same location would in most contexts constitute a pattern worth examining. It didn't happen here. 80 miles northeast, On Sunland Hospital Road in Tallahassee, a different kind of report accumulated in the files of the Leon County Sheriff's Office and FHP. Multiple officers and civilians reported seeing a figure standing on or near the roadside at night, appearing suddenly, sometimes in the roadway itself, non-responsive to vehicle lights or sirens, and disappearing when officers approached on foot. No individual was ever identified or contacted in connection with these sightings. No explanation was provided in the public record. Sunland Hospital was a state-run facility for children with severe disabilities. It operated from the 1950s until its closure in the 1980s, following a federal investigation that documented patient abuse, neglect, and conditions described in official reports as inhumane. The road leading to the former site still carries the hospital's name. The facility's history is well known locally, and the road itself has become associated with the reports of the figure. The pattern described in those reports is distinct. Pedestrians, when approached by law enforcement, typically react. They move, speak, acknowledge the presence of the vehicle or the officer. The figure described in these reports did none of that. It was described as static, facing the road or standing in place, and vanishing, not fleeing, not walking away, but no longer present when officers exited their vehicles or returned to the location. Officers are trained observers, but they are also human. Misidentification, environmental factors, and expectation can all influence perception. But these reports were formal filings, not informal mentions. Filing a report about something that could be interpreted as paranormal invites scrutiny, skepticism, and potential professional consequences. That creates a disincentive to document unless the officer genuinely could not account for what they observed through conventional explanations. What differentiates these cases from others in this video is the source. These are not civilian reports filtered through dispatch or secondhand accounts. These are observations made by officers on patrol in locations they travel regularly, under conditions they are trained to assess. When the observer is the officer, the documentation is direct. There is no interpretation layer, no delayed reporting, no question of whether the person making the report was qualified to evaluate what they saw. The reports exist. The observations were deemed significant enough to document. And in both cases, the amber light on US 319 and the figure on Sunland Hospital Road, the official response was the same. Acknowledgement without investigation, documentation without follow-up, reports filed and left unresolved. What that says about how agencies handle observations that resist conventional explanation is not speculation. It's visible in the record itself. Some cases are solved, some remain open, and some are closed without resolution. Not because investigators determined what happened, but because the case was administratively concluded. No charges filed, no definitive explanation entered into the record, just a notation that the file is no longer active. That closure serves the record, but it doesn't serve the question. And in Florida, where jurisdiction is fragmented across agencies, roadways cross vast uninhabited areas, and transient populations move through without local networks, closure without resolution is more common than the public record suggests. On September 20th, 1974, a body was found in a vehicle at the Interstate 75 southbound rest area in Alachua County. The victim's death was investigated, but never conclusively explained. The case is listed in the Alachua County Sheriff's Office cold case database. What makes it unusual is not the location. Rest areas are public, high-visibility sites where incidents occur regularly. But the response: a single FHP officer was dispatched to the scene. There is no documentation in the accessible public record explaining why a potential homicide at a rest area a location that typically draws immediate backup and multi-agency coordination, was handled by one officer. The report from that day is sparse. Minimal scene documentation. Few witness interviews, despite the rest area being a public location with steady traffic. The case was eventually closed without charges and without a definitive determination of cause of death. The file, as it exists in the public record, offers almost no detail about what investigators concluded, or whether they concluded anything at all. This was 1974. Before dashcams, before digital dispatch logs, before the standardized protocols that now govern how officers document scenes and collect evidence. Agencies had significant latitude in what they recorded and how they processed cases. That latitude created gaps, and some of those gaps were never filled. What remains is a case that was opened, investigated to some minimal threshold, and closed without the resolution that would normally accompany closure. 300 miles south, along the overseas highway, a different kind of gap has persisted for decades. US 1 through the Florida Keys is the only road. There are no alternate routes, no parallel corridors, no way to travel the islands except by this single highway. And yet multiple people have disappeared along the stretch between Marathon and Big Pine Key. Last seen on that road, never located, cases still open or closed without recovery of remains. Monroe County Sheriff's Office handles most of these investigations. Some involve tourists, individuals with no local connections and no reason anyone would expect them to vanish. Others involve transient individuals, seasonal workers, people passing through. The cases share a geographic concentration, but no verified serial predator has been identified. What connects them is the road, the isolation, and the fact that in an environment where there is only one route, people still disappear without a clear point of departure. FHP patrol coverage in the Keys is sparse. Officers describe response times that can exceed 30 minutes, depending on where the call originates and where the nearest unit is positioned. That's not negligence, it's geography. The highway is over 100 miles long, crosses water on bridges with no shoulders, and serves a population that fluctuates seasonally. There are stretches where an officer could drive for 20 minutes without encountering another patrol unit. The marine environment is the other variable. Bodies that enter the water in the Keys are subject to strong currents, rapid decomposition in warm salt water, and scavenging by marine life. Investigators openly acknowledge that remains may never be recoverable, even when they have a strong suspicion of what occurred. Missing persons cases in this area are often missing because there is no body to locate, no physical evidence that survives long enough to be found. That creates a situation where someone can vanish on a single road in an area with constant traffic, and investigators are left with a timeline, a last known location, and nothing else. The visibility paradox: one road, dozens of witnesses passing by every hour, yet no one sees what happened. That's not supernatural. That's the gap between what people assume they would notice and what they actually observe while driving 70 miles an hour with their attention on the road ahead. 200 miles north in Broward County, human remains have been discovered in the canal system that runs parallel to Alligator Alley. In at least one case, investigators recovered a severed head from a canal off the Zouage 75. 2 men were later convicted of the murder, but investigators never conclusively established where the killing occurred. The body was never found. What remains unexplained is how evidence was disposed of on a heavily patrolled toll road without detection. Alligator Alley is not remote in the way people think of remote. It's a modern highway, 4 lanes, regular FHP presence, toll plazas with cameras at both ends. The canal system runs parallel to the road, separated by a low berm and vegetation, but visible from the highway at many points. Access exists, but it requires someone to pull off the road, exit their vehicle, and approach the canal, all actions that would be visible to passing traffic and patrol units. The timing required is narrow. Stop, access the canal, dispose of remains, leave. That has to happen in the window between patrol passes, in a location where other drivers either don't notice or don't report what they see. Investigators note that the canal system was built for drainage, but it also created a parallel corridor that is visually and physically separated from the highway by just enough distance to provide concealment. Infrastructure designed for one purpose, used for another. The other variable is environmental. Alligators, carrion birds, aquatic decomposition. Investigators describe how wildlife accelerates the destruction of remains and scatters evidence across a wide area. Whether that calculation is made by the individuals disposing of evidence, or whether it's coincidence, is not something the public record clarifies. What is clear is that the environment does the work of concealment without requiring any additional effort. These three cases, the rest area body, the overseas highway disappearances, the severed head in the canal, share a common thread. They were investigated, reports were filed, evidence was collected, or at least attempts were made. And then the cases were closed, not because investigators determined what happened, but because the file reached a point where no further action was taken. Closure without resolution is an administrative function. It clears the active case list. It does not answer the question. Florida's infrastructure, geography, and population create conditions where cases can go cold, not because of investigative failure, but because the environment itself resists clarity. Transient populations leave few traces. Vast uninhabited areas border densely populated corridors. Patrol coverage is stretched across distances that make rapid response difficult. And the official record reflects that, not in what it explains, but in what it leaves unresolved. Not every case gets solved. Not every report leads to an investigation. But the reports still exist. This video covered 10 incidents where Florida Highway Patrol officers, county investigators, and federal agencies documented something. And then the record went quiet. Some were marked informational, some were closed administratively, some just stopped appearing in follow-up filings. What connects them isn't paranormal evidence or conspiracy. It's the gap between what was observed and what was explained. Officers filed these reports because something crossed a threshold requiring documentation. The absence of follow-up is part of the record itself. If you want to verify any of these cases, sources and agency references are in the description below.